Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. You can see my screen, yes?
Yes, we do.
Okay, wonderful. So the title of my talk is Increasing Interspike Interval Variability Can Decrease Instantaneous Firing Rate Dispersion. This work was done with my supervisor, Professor Lubomir Kostal, and I will, okay, yeah. So I'll start with the outline. First, I'll talk about spike trains as stochastic processes. Then I'm going to talk about the statistical analysis of stochastic neural activity. And here I'll introduce the concept of instantaneous rate. And then I'm going to talk about the statistical dispersion measures that we're going to use for our analysis. After that, I'm going to talk about the results where we applied our proposed methods to the standard ISI models. And we considered 4 standard ISI models, as well as we also applied our results to some experimental data. After that, I'll talk about the conclusions of what we found out. So to start with, I don't know how it works. Okay. Yeah, so to start with, I'll first talk about the spike trains as stochastic processes. Right, so the class of stochastic processes whose realizations consist of a sequence of point events in time is called stochastic point processes. And spike trains, they are described as stochastic point processes where the spikes, they correspond to the events. So the spikes or the action potentials, and those are the events. So for any stochastic point process, there are 2 ways of describing it. We can describe it in the terms of number of events occurring during a time window, how many events occurred in a particular time window, or in terms of the interval between these occurring events. So consequently, to describe a spike train, we can also use these 2 different ways of description. Either we can use the sequence of spike times, which I have termed here as x1 and x2, or we can describe the spike train through the interspike intervals, which we define as the time that is between two consequent spikes. So here is a graphical description of a spike train. The interspike interval is termed t, and it belongs to the probability distribution f of t. And it is the time that is between 2 consequent spike, xi and xi plus 1. Going further, renewal processes. That's what I'm going to describe on this slide. But before that, I'm going to talk about a class of stochastic point processes called stationary point process. So a stationary point process is the point process where the joint distribution of the number of spikes in any k time intervals, it doesn't depend on the displacement variable h that you choose. So it doesn't matter which h you choose, the joint probability distribution is going to be the same. Now, an important subclass of this stationary point process is called the renewal point processes, in which the length t of consequent interspike intervals is an independently and identically distributed random variable. And the probability distribution I've termed here as f of t. Now, in the talk, I'm going to talk exclusively about renewal point processes, and they're often used to model the activity of spontaneously active cells. Now, in renewal point processes, there are 2 very important subclasses of it. The first subclass is called equilibrium renewal process. So, equilibrium renewal process, in this, the time origin where the process starts, it doesn't coincide with an event. So say xi here is the spiking event, but the origin starts at a random time that is unrelated to the spike times. This is termed the equilibrium renewal process, as opposed to the ordinary renewal process, in which the origin time, it coincides with a spiking event. So these are the 2 important subclasses of renewal processes. We're going to focus on equilibrium renewal process, and why I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, let me jump to the next section, which is the statistical analysis of the stochastic neural activity. Right, so let me introduce the concept of the instantaneous firing rate. It is typically defined as the inverse of the interspike interval t. However, as Lansky and colleagues showed in their 2004 paper, the mean of the the mean of the instantaneous firing rate is higher than or equal to the mean firing rate, which is also equal this 1 over E of t. This is the mean firing rate, and it also equals to the point process intensity. So this is the inequality that persists, and that's why you can't use the mean of the instantaneous firing rate in place of the mean firing rate generally. However, this inequality, it disappears if you remember that the instance where you want to observe the instantaneous firing rate, it generally does not coincide with a spiking event. I'll explain that further. This is a graph that's taken from the paper that was published by Kostal and colleagues in Chaos Journal in 2018. So what do I mean when I say that the instance where you observe the instantaneous firing rate doesn't coincide with a spike? All right, so remember we talked about the equilibrium renewal processes where the time origin does not coincide with the spiking event. The same principle here, we have different spike trains here, and the instance where we observe the instantaneous rate given here, the observation time titled T naught, it's unrelated to the spikes. It's not in sync with any of these spike trains. So in this case, the interspike interval that we observe here, they are going to, the probability of us observing an interspike interval is going to be proportional to the length of the interval. In simple terms, the longer the interspike interval is, the higher is the probability that we're going to encounter the interval. Right, in this case, the interval that we observed, these are termed the length biased intervals. Yeah, because their length actually impacts if we're going to observe them or not. So these are depicted as T tilde, and in this case, the instantaneous rate that we have, I'm going to call it R. So R is equal to 1 over the length bias interval instead of, just being 1 over interspike interval. So in this case, the R that we have, that's going to satisfy this equality, which means the mean instantaneous firing rate, E of R, is going to be equal to the point process intensity. So this inequality that we had, in case of observing the length bias intervals, it turns into an equality. So for the rest of the presentation, when I talk about the instantaneous rate, I'm talking about R, which is the inverse of the length bias intervals. So keeping that in mind, let me talk about the statistics that we're going to look at in this talk. So I'm going to talk about interspike interval statistic, and I'm going to talk about the instantaneous rate statistic. So interspike interval is going to give us the temporal perspective of the spiking data, and the instantaneous rate statistics is going to tell us about the rate coding perspective. But in a way, the instantaneous rate statistic is going to tie into the rate coding perspective because it's instantaneous rate, and also the temporal perspective, because by definition, this takes into account the spike timing. Right, so we're going to talk about the variability and randomness of these two quantities. And for variability, we're going to use the coefficient of variation. And for randomness, we're going to use a CH, which I'm going to expand on further. But first, I want to talk about the variability and randomness. So variability and randomness, these are two very similar quantities that we use to further differentiate between the spike trains that might seem similar from the rate coding perspective. But it's important to distinguish between these two quantities, because we might have really variable data, but it might not be random at all. If, for example, if we talk about data from uniform distribution, right? So highly variable data might not be random at all. To expand on that further, let's look at these three instances. This is going to make it clear. So in the first instance, we look at that the data is really concentrated around the mean. So we have really low variability in the data. All the values are concentrated with negligible spread around the mean. So the randomness is low, as well as the variability is low. The randomness is low because we can easily predict what are the values going to be. In the second instance, we see that the variability is high, the peaks are far apart, but the randomness is low because the data is going to have really predictable values, either this or this. in the third instance, we see that the randomness is high, and because the spread of the data is wider, the variability is high as well. Right. So after this, so we have the variability and the randomness. After this, I'm going to talk about the dispersion measures that we have used to quantify the variability. So the standard dispersion measure for variability that's generally used is the standard deviation of the ISIs. But here we use the relative dispersion quantity, that is the coefficient of variation of the interspike interval, which is defined as the standard deviation divided by the mean of the ISIs. The coefficient of, I'll just expand on this further. The coefficient of variation, we use this instead of the standard deviation because CV, it's a dimensionless quantity. So in case we have, it doesn't depend on the units of the interspike intervals, and it doesn't depend also on the linear scaling. And building upon this, we derive the definition for the coefficient of variation of the instantaneous rate. The derivation is given in the 2021 paper. So advantage of using CV is that for exponential distribution, CV of ISI is going to be 1, regardless of the mean of the distribution. Conversely, if you have CV with the value 1, that does not really imply the exponentiality of the distribution. So standard deviation or CV, it measures how much the PDF, how much the probability distribution is spread with respect to the mean value of the data. But however, whether it be standard deviation or CV, it doesn't really quantify how random the values are. So even with even with the standard deviation and CV, we still don't cover all the ways the spike trains can be different from each other, even though they might seem similar from the rate coding perspective. And that's where the randomness comes in. So the dispersion measure that we use for the randomness, to quantify the randomness, as a further describing characteristic of spike trains, we use the entropy-based measure, and that's called the differential entropy, which is defined here for a continuous random variable x. But we don't use h by itself as the dispersion measure here, because h can take either positive or negative values, and also it also depends on the scaling. So we really need a relative measure. So to get there, we first consider the entropy-based dispersion coefficient of randomness called the sigma h, which was derived in a 2013 paper by Kostel and colleagues, and it can also be seen in a 2010 paper by Kostel and Marsalek. Now we have the entropy-based dispersion coefficient of randomness. Using this, we can derive the relative entropy-based dispersion coefficient, which again is, we termed it CH, and it's achieved by dividing the sigma of h by the mean when it comes to ISI distributions. Similarly, the sigma h and ch for the instantaneous rate are, they're defined analogously. We just change t to r here, and the definitions remain the same. So unlike the coefficient of variation, when we have the value of ch as 1, it only occurs in the case of an exponential distribution, and this is the maximum value of ch. So now we have, I have described what instantaneous rate is, and I have talked about randomness and variability, and I have talked about different measures that we are going to use to quantify the randomness and variability for the rate coding perspective and the temporal coding perspective, which means the T and the R that we talked about before. So now let's look at some results. So for results, we're going to consider the standard interspike interval models of neuronal activity. And we're going to restrict ourselves to the framework of renewal spiking activity. So for that, the first 3 models that we consider, that is the gamma distribution, log normal distribution, and the inverse Gaussian distribution. Right, so these are scale family distributions. The probability distributions are parameterized by the intensity, lambda, and they satisfy this peculiar property here. The fourth distribution that we will talk about is the distribution involving a refractory period. So first, I'm going to show you the results for the variability and randomness for these four distributions together. After that, we are going to take a look at something more complicated, slightly more complicated. That's the mixture of two distributions with that time. Analytically, this gets more complicated. But after that, we're going to look at what all of this actually means when it comes to experimental data and where we can apply the results, the analysis that we have seen in this talk. So let's start. First, let's look at the dispersion measures of variability. So we're going to first look at the first four models that we talked about. That was the gamma distribution, the log normal distribution, inverse Gaussian distribution, and the shifted exponential distribution. And we are looking at the dispersion measures of variability, which is the coefficient of variation of the interspike interval here on the x-axis, and the coefficient of variation of the instantaneous rate. That's here on the y-axis. Right, so let's start with the gamma distribution. So for the gamma distribution, as you see here, the coefficient of variation of the instantaneous rate, it is higher than the coefficient of variation of the interspike interval. And as the value of the CV of ISI, as it approaches 1, we see that the coefficient of variation of R, it approaches infinity. And it happens because as CV of T for gamma, as the value is 1, the gamma distribution becomes exponential distribution. And consequently, the value of CV of R is infinity. Then if we look at the log normal and inverse Gaussian distribution, that's here, both of them, we see that the relationship between the CV of T and CV of R is that of identity. So nothing really changes if you jump from the ISI data to the instantaneous rate data. They both have similar dispersion measures of variability. And why does that happen? That's because for these two distributions, the log normal and inverse Gaussian distribution, the probability distribution functions of the instantaneous rate and the ISI, they hold this symmetrical property. So they have the same profile. If lambda is equal to 1, if we have the intensity equal to 1, the profiles of the instantaneous rate and interspike interval are going to have the same shape. So that translates to their CVs having the same profile as well. Then coming back to the shifted exponential distribution, where the relationship is not identity, we see that the coefficient of the coefficient of variability, CVR, it's less than CV of T until a certain value. And after that, the CV of T approaches 1. Right, okay. Now, so this was the relationship between the coefficient, between the dispersion measures of variability. Now, if we look at the dispersion measure of randomness for these four models, we see that the relationship is a little bit more complicated. So first, I'm going to talk about these three distributions. They are the scale family distribution. In the direction of the arrows, we have coefficient of variation of the interspike interval going from 0 to infinity. So if we start for the gamma distribution, this starts at 0 and it increases first and then it decreases. And it is the case for all these three distributions. So let's start at the beginning. So in the beginning, we have the coefficient of variation of the ISI is 0. So in that case, it's approaching 0, CHR is approaching 0 as well, and as well as CHT for these two distributions here. And as the value of CVT increases, the value of CHT and CHR both increase. The randomness keeps increasing until a certain point. After that, it starts decreasing. And as we have the CVT approaching infinity, both CHR and CHT for these three distributions, it approaches 0. Then we have the shifted exponential distribution. So for shifted exponential distribution, CHT here, it increases as a function of CVT. So as variability increases in the interspike intervals, the randomness increases as well. But if we look at the instantaneous rate, it increases the function of ISI variability up to a certain point, and then it starts declining. So this was the dispersion measures of randomness. The relationships between different measures are not that straightforward as you would expect. Now going back to one of the other models, the
You have
mixture.
5 minutes
Yes.
included the questions, so 2 minutes in order to have questions.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna be really fast. So this was this was the mixed distribution and the theoretical part of it. All right. So with the mixture of two exponential distribution with refractory period signified as tau, and the mixture components are A and B. Theoretically, it was really hard to obtain the formulas for CV and CH. So we just simulated it with some parameters. We kept one parameter fixed and we changed the other parameter. And the relationship was really complicated, but this becomes clearer when we looked at the experimental data. So we looked at some experimental data that was obtained for this from the spontaneously active afferent neurons in the zebrafish lateral line. And I'm going to skip on the explanation of the spiking data, just that the ISI data found in these experiment, it was best fitted to a mixture of exponential distribution with that time, the one that we just looked at. So in this case, if we look at the CV of T and CV of R for this data, we see that the neurons, which might have similar CV of T values, which might have they can still be differentiated on the basis of their CV of R values. And we get similar results from the CH values. If you see here, these neurons, if you look at the randomness of their interspike intervals, these neurons have similar values, but you can still differentiate among them on the basis of their CHR values. This confirms our assertion that the instantaneous rate, it provides us with a different or novel outlook on the spiking data that's different from instantaneous rate, and which is what I talk about in the conclusions, which I'm going to just share here with you, that there are different relationships between the variability and randomness measures. And for a given model of ISI, an increase in the dispersion measures of ISI may result either in an increase or decrease, depending on the model. So the statistics can provide us with a different outlook on neural data, and it's worth looking into. And thank you so much for listening to me. I'll end my talk with this. And if you want more information, you can look at our paper, which was published last year in Frontiers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rimizin. We have time just for one question, if any. Otherwise, you can write in the chat and she will answer in the chat.
So I have one question, if it's possible. So
Yes.
I enjoyed very much, very, very nice presentation of this stochastic framework. What puzzles me is the following: you don't have a single point process, you have a system of interacting point process. Could you please say something about the way you present the system itself? Because, well, you have problems of existence and so on, the properties. Did you think about the description of the system of interacting point process like the one you presented?
It's actually not a system. I probably didn't present it as better as I could have. It's just different processes. I consider them independently. I just presenting them together so you can see how different they are from each other, the relationship.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If there are any more questions, I would be happy to chat about it.
Thank you.